anonymously. Please indicate that when you submit your question. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to be introducing Sarah. A 2020 graduate of Vassar College, Sarah Chapman is an aspiring writer with interests in American arts and culture and feminist critical theory. Her senior thesis explored these topics through a comparison of photographic self-portraiture by Cindy Sherman and Martine Gutierrez, and we'll be hearing a portion of that work in today's talk. In her final year at Vassar, Sarah worked as an arts education intern at Dia Beacon, where she became familiar with the museum's collection and its learner-centered approach to contemporary art education. Upon graduating, she received departmental honors and was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. Congrats, Sarah. She currently lives in New York City, and her quarantine hobbies include baking cookies for family and friends, practicing classic rock keyboard riffs, which I would like to hear, and watching scary movies. So welcome, Sarah, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm really excited to have seen how many people are here. And yeah, so I'm really excited to talk about Martine Gutierrez, Cindy Sherman, and feminism. I'm going to begin sharing my screen and my presentation, and then we'll get started. Okay, Jessica, can we see in here?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oops, spoilers, sorry. Okay, so before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to be approaching this discussion today, which is to say that I'm going to be using an approach I became intimately familiar with in my time studying art history at Vassar, which is visual analysis. So what that means is that my discussion will start with what we can see and use that information to ask questions and form hypotheses about how we can understand the work of art as a whole. So for each work I show you, I'm going to be considering the following questions, and I hope you'll keep them in mind too, but I will remind you. What do we see in this photograph? What are the choices the artist makes? And what questions do these visual elements and choices lead us to ask? These questions are an outline of visual analysis that helps me move from making observations to asking questions and forming interpretations. So let's begin. The first image that we're looking at is by Martine Gutierrez, who is an American artist born in 1989. The title of this piece is Girlfriends, Anita and Marie 7, and it was created in 2014. So we can't really do what I would usually call close looking because you guys have to look at a shared screen. But I just want to take like 20 to 30 seconds for everyone to look closely at this image and just really try to think about those questions. What do we see? What choices do the artist make? And what questions do those lead us to ask? So I'll give you 25 seconds starting now. Time. Okay. So what I would first notice when I looked at this picture is that there are two female presenting figures. And then kind of on a second glance, I would notice that one of them is actually a mannequin, and that the two figures look very similar. And probably the second thing I'd notice is the outdoor setting, which appears to be Monument Valley in the American Southwest. In fact, this is a very recognizable setting to anyone who's seen Stagecoach or Forrest Gump. And kind of with that in mind, it becomes clear that this isn't actually an on-location shot. This is using a photographic backdrop, which we can tell both from the fact that you can actually see the backdrop kind of rippling at the top where the sky is, and also from the fact that there are other things that make it obvious. And so yeah, so the two figures and the setting really come out. And then the next question is, what are the choices the artist makes? So to include the mannequin is one choice, and to use a photographic backdrop is another choice. What do those questions lead us? What did those choices lead us to ask? And I would say the main thing is who and or what in this image is real. And of course, that leads to the question of how are we defining real? So before getting into that, let's look at the comparison image, and then we'll look at them side by side. So I compared this image to Cindy Sherman's Untitled Film Still number 43, which you can tell by the buttes in the background, that's the name of those geological formations, that she is also situating herself in Monument Valley in the American Southwest. She's sitting on a tree, which would be an unusual thing to find out there, which makes it seem like this could be a studio shot too. So like Anita and Marie 7, there is that ambiguity. What's real? Is the setting real? And there's only one figure, also female presenting in this. So that's another choice, was not to include a second figure. And what questions did that lead us to ask? Again, who and what is real? So looking at these two images side by side, what brings them together most prominently in my mind is the location in Monument Valley, which I think in American culture most distinctively brings us back to Western films. I mean, the Western genre of film, not film from the West. And this particular period of film production in which Sherman visually situates herself corresponds with a time when the Western was an enormously popular genre, branching out from cinema into newer media, including television. Gutierrez's choice of this particular backdrop is also in dialogue with the Western genre. However, Gutierrez's positionality within the narrative context of the West is entirely different from Sherman's, considering her identity as a transgender Indigenous Latinx woman. Now, before I move on, I want to note that this is not simply a what's similar and what's different comparison. Looking at it that way wouldn't reveal much more than the fact that two works created by two different artists in two different contexts are different, which is obvious. Rather, I am tracing the evolution of feminist ideology as it is illustrated by a comparison of Sherman's and Gutierrez's works. So let's add in some context. We know that these are self-portraits of the artists. Further, we have the context given to the works in the form of their titles: Sherman's Untitled Film Still and Gutierrez's Girlfriends, Anita and Marie. Knowing this, we can revisit the questions each work asks about what and who is real. What does it mean for us to ask this question about each artist? So what I mean by that is that by calling her works Untitled Film Stills, Sherman is suggesting to the viewer that she may be embodying a character in each still. And by calling her own photographs Girlfriends, Martine Gutierrez is suggesting to the viewer maybe what is the relationship between the artist and the mannequin? Who are these women? How are they related to one another? And giving them names so that we know they're supposed to be two distinct people. So let's move on to the next comparison, and then we'll bring it all around at the end. So the next comparison is Anita and Marie, girlfriends, Anita and Marie 2. And this one you'll see there's a swimming pool. In this particular image, it's very difficult to tell which figure is the artist and which is the mannequin. This one is unique among the series Girlfriends in that, not literally unique because there is another one that includes another mannequin, but most of them only have the artist and her look-alike mannequin. Whereas in this one, a second mannequin is introduced as sort of a voyeur or a lurker. And then in Untitled Film Still number 46, we see the artist with her face completely obscured by a mask, and her body completely obscured by the water she's swimming in. So looking at these two side by side, they both prominently feature the water as a compositional element. They both obscure the identifying features of the artist, even though they are self-portraits. And they both use a prop in order to manipulate the gaze in some way. So in the Cindy Sherman work, the prop of the mask is manipulating the gaze in that it is for the viewer an obscuring force, but for the wearer an elucidating force. And then in Anita and Marie 2, the prop being the additional mannequin, dressing the second mannequin in masculine clothing and positioning it so that it appears to avert its gaze, the artist is visually invoking voyeurism and the gaze using the prosthetic function of the mannequin. So in both photographs, the manipulation of props and photography point out the play of subjectivity and objectivity at the center of any self-portraiture. What I mean by that is that in a self-portrait, there is kind of a paradox of subjectivity and objectivity, because the artist who puts herself on display is also the object being put on display. Moving on to the next comparison, Anita and Marie 3 and Untitled Film Still number 6. This is Anita and Marie 3, and this is Untitled Film Still number 6. So in both of these, you see the artist reclining, posing with an angular elbow. And again, both photographs show a prop being used in a way that manipulates the gaze. So in Martine Gutierrez's photograph, the mannequin is a prop that is as a double of the body, as a point of comparison for the body of the artist, manipulates the gaze of the viewer. And in the Cindy Sherman photograph, the artist is holding a mirror, which could be interpreted in a number of ways, but the way that she pushes its reflective surface against the sheets to cover it up, it kind of reminds me of the paradox of the mask in the last comparison, where what should be opening up another perspective is instead hiding it. So in these photographs, and I'm going to be using some sticky terminology here, but what functions aesthetically as a prop in these photographs functions phenomenologically as a prosthetic. Defining a prosthetic as an artificial extension of the body that enables the user to function in a particular way, we can understand the mirror in Sherman's work and the mannequin in Gutierrez's as prosthetics that allow the artist to be both subject and object of the gaze. This construction of prosthetics also applies to the photographic apparatus. The camera allows one body to be both subject and object, and is thus a prosthesis in the same sense as the mannequin and the mirror. And the final comparison is between Anita and Marie 1 and Untitled Film Still number 47. And looking at them side by side, these are both outdoor shots featuring a figure dressed in white. They both invoke idea or feeling of seclusion. Martine Gutierrez's by situating it in the woods in a clearing, and Cindy Sherman's by being surrounded by a high privacy fence. And compositionally, another similarity here is that there's a lot of foliage going on. So these also manipulate the gaze through, rather than props as much, setting, by giving the viewer this sort of intimate glimpse into something that maybe wasn't meant to be seen, as indicated by the settings and costumes of the figures that we're seeing. So you may be wondering what all of this has to do with feminism. Sherman and Gutierrez both participate in image making in a way that reflects their feminism. As a result, their works are a part of feminist visual culture because they are visual objects created within American feminism in the late 1970s to 80s, and then in the 2010s. The same idea that differentiates feminism when Sherman produced Untitled Film Stills from feminism when Gutierrez produced Girlfriends differentiates feminist visual culture in those times: intersectionality. To understand this, let's go to the source. Audre Lorde's essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," critically assesses feminist theory and activism at the time of her writing it in 1983, not long after the Untitled Film Stills were produced. Lorde discusses the erasure of identities that can exist in parallel to womanhood, such as Blackness and queerness, stating that liberation cannot occur as long as these identities are overlooked. Lorde notes that in context, this erasure appears as the assertion that because women are united in womanhood, no coexistent identities need to be included in the cause of women's liberation. As an alternative, Lorde offers that difference must, quote, "difference must be not merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic," end quote. Where the conventional view is that recognizing racial differences between women will divide the cause of women's liberation by raising issues of racial liberation, Lorde suggests that, quote, "difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged," end quote. Lorde's critique applies not only to feminist theory and activism in the United States in 1983, but to feminist visual culture in that time and place as well. Cindy Sherman's Untitled Film Stills of 1977 through 1980 visually embody the feminism among which the artist worked, in effect embodying the problems with conventional feminism theorized not long after by Lorde and other feminist theorists. Within Lorde's framework, Sherman's visual project cannot meet liberatory ends. Visually denying racial and other differences among women, the artist's choice to depict herself within the context of mid-20th century Western film characters represents an attempt to deconstruct the image of a narrow definition of women using the very same tools of the hegemony which constructs that image. In Girlfriends, Gutierrez composes images with cinematic qualities, but she doesn't directly contextualize them through film. The fact that the artist represents herself in the absence of a long precedent of representations of women like her is also significant. Whereas Sherman follows up on an image of Western women upheld by the interests of the film industry, Gutierrez must set her own precedent for her representation. Sherman's use of the visual language of mid-20th century Western cinema corresponds with the limited scope of feminist visual culture in her context and with the artist's lived experience. She comments on how women are represented in images using a set of images that contain the visual traces of being produced within a racist and white supremacist visual culture. For example, the cinematic precedent enabling Sherman to recognizably embody a range of different characters and tropes through a series of staged stills does not exist for women of color. As a white woman, Sherman has the ability to embody the predominant and even hegemonic image of the woman, which pervades both media and feminism at the expense of the representation of others. This is not an indictment of Sherman's work or a denial of her intent, but rather an observation about how Sherman's work constructs a feminist visual culture that is indicative of the historical context in which it was produced. Where Sherman's work illustrates the oversights within 20th century feminism, Gutierrez's work constructs a feminist visual culture within the intersectional framework. The nature of the question Gutierrez asks in Girlfriends, Anita and Marie evolves out of the visual culture precedent Sherman sets with Untitled Film Stills. There is again a parallel with the evolution of feminist theory. When presented with the question of how to make the workplace equal, for example, non-intersectional mainstream feminism responds that CEOs need to be female. In contrast, when an intersectional or post-colonial perspective is brought in, the reality that engaging in identity politics within an unequal capitalist power structure cannot ensure equity becomes clear. Similarly, Sherman's approach seems to be to make equitable the appearance of women in images by placing herself in the position of photographer and objectifier, rather than reconsidering the power dynamics of image creation. Gutierrez instead goes to the core of the problem, addressing the relationship between subject and object in a concrete way by physically objectifying herself and including that physical object, the mannequin, in the image. As a result, we can understand the feminist visual culture Gutierrez constructs in her photography as intersectional. As a final comment, this distinction is especially important in the context of 2020's racial justice movement. Those who cannot hear Black Lives Matter without responding All Lives Matter participate in the erasure of difference that renders actual liberation impossible. Lord's assertion that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house points out that reform is an attempt to do just that. When we identify as intersectional feminists, we must hold ourselves to account as anti-racists and abolitionists. As Lord says, the need to do so is, quote, only threatening to those who still define the master's house as their only source of support, end quote. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And I have a million questions. I might be a little selfish and ask you one right off the bat that I have.
Please do.
So you made it so clear in your visual analysis and your side-by-side comparison why we would look at these two photographers' work next to each other. And yet it's actually a really, it's a comparison that I hadn't thought about, and now it seems so clear and obvious that you've made it. So I wonder if you could tell us how you came to write about these two artists in comparison with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, as some of you know, this project, these comparisons were my senior essay topic. So I became interested in, I really found it through the idea of embodiment. I was interested in different forms of embodiment in art and what that meant. And my advisor pointed me in the direction of Martine Gutierrez. And I think really from thinking of it as photographic self-portraiture was where I made the connection to Cindy Sherman. And also the idea of props and prosthetics. And I was thinking about some of Sherman's later works where she really uses a lot of makeup prosthetics. And I was thinking about that in parallel to just having a mannequin that looks like you. So yeah, those were a few of my percolating thoughts.
Thank you. Okay, Our first audience question comes from Bella Dalton-Finkel, who asks, do you have any thoughts about why Gutierrez chose the names Anita and Marie for these characters?
Hi, Bella. That's a great question. I thought about why she chose to give them names, period, but not really about the specific names. And then my one pedestrian thought on that would be like, you know, Marie, Mary, some kind of purity association. But I really hadn't dug into that, and I'd be really interested to hear, because I know Bella probably has some like really well-informed thought on this. If you think there is a reason.
Okay, our next question comes from Griffin Pion, who asks, why do you think both artists use black and white photography for their respective series? If you think they have different reasons for doing so, do you think this is related to each artist's respective feminism?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me take a deep breath on that one. Yeah, I think, well, I'll answer it kind of one artist at a time. I think that Cindy Sherman's use of black and white is supposed to be a reference to the period of filmmaking that she's referencing, by, you know, with the Untitled Film Stills, which is sort of the 1950s to 60s. So I think in her case, it's a formal choice that is supposed to make it clear that she's making an allusion and kind of add to the verisimilitude of it being a film still. In Martine Gutierrez's case, I actually do have some thoughts on that, which is that black and white film kind of has interesting interactions with depictions of different races because of the way it manipulates skin color. So I do think that their different experiences and their different feminisms could inform each of them making that choice separately to use black and white film. And what I mean by that is that in black and white, different skin tones can look more or less lighter or darker than they would in color. So it can become more difficult or easier to perceive people as being a different race. So yeah, and I also think that the black and white with Gutierrez's use of the mannequin makes it harder to distinguish who is real and who's the mannequin. So yeah, I think that there are overlapping, you know, you could do a Venn diagram. There are overlapping reasons and different reasons. And I think, yeah, it does have to do with their different, the different visual cultures of feminism.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee. The question is, it's a series of questions. Are the production processes similar for each artist? Do they produce multiple images before selecting a piece to name? Do similarities or differences in the process of production, i.e. film or digital, relate to their experiences creating these pieces?
Yeah, I know that the production process for the Untitled Film Stills is much more broad and longer term. So like the collection of photographs titled Untitled Film Stills are from 1977 to 1980, but also Sherman continues to work kind of in that, forgetting the word, but in that modality later, after she moves away from the title Untitled Film Stills. Whereas Girlfriends is either 2 or 3 series, each with a different set of first names associated with them, of black and white photographs, and they're all produced in 2014, I believe. So the main difference in the production processes is that the Gutierrez series came out more compressed. And I think, let me just look back to the rest of the question, as I can see it in the chat. Do they produce multiple images before selecting a piece to name? That is a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. Yeah, my guess would be that Sherman, I think, took a great deal of these photographs and sort of released them at various times, like in no particular order and with different numbers. I don't know if they were released in chronological order of the numbers or not. And do similarities or differences in the process of production relate to their experiences creating these pieces? Yeah, I definitely think so. Like there's a couple by Martine Gutierrez that look like there might have been some digital image editing done on them, which wouldn't have been possible when Cindy Sherman was doing what she was doing. And that does just open up a whole other world of possibilities and speak to a whole other world of like visual culture and feminist visual culture that Martine Gutierrez would be steeped in. Like, you know, the fact that feminism in the 1970s and 80s like didn't even know what Photoshop was. And by 2014, when Martine Gutierrez is making these photographs, it's you know, has almost even come full circle from being like perceived as anti-feminist to being perceived as potentially empowering. So yeah.
Interesting, thank you. Our next question comes from an attendee named Kat. Question is, in your opinion, is there an element of or comment on gender performativity in each artist's use of prosthesis? Does this comment that they're making differ between the two artists?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think they're both commenting on gender performativity. I think one thought I've often had about the way Gutierrez uses the mannequin is that the mannequin is what we would think of as like genderless or sexless, but at the same time, in that it doesn't actually have like reproductive organs. At the same time, we're pretty quick to look at that mannequin and identify it as female. Almost more quickly than we might be able to look at a transgender person and identify them as female. So I think that aspect of gender performativity is definitely being commented on in Gutierrez's work. And also in Sherman's, in that, you know, her poses and the tropes and characters she embodies are often sexualized in some way. And the context she was doing it in, posing in her underwear in the late 70s, not that it would have been that crazy, but just that it did mean something different. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if I've answered the whole question, but yeah. Yeah, I think the comment on gender, does the comment differ between them? That's the second part of the question. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the way they've each experienced gender performativity is obviously the difference between being cisgender and the difference between being transgender, which is that, like, you know, gender performativity is at the heart of that. So yeah, I definitely think that those comments differ.
It's interesting. I'm just going to insert myself with a comment. It's interesting what you said about the mannequin being kind of asexual, though of course we immediately read it as gendered, because that was sort of the opposite of what I was thinking as we were looking at the pictures, which is that they are so, you know, they're like Barbie dolls. They're these stereotypes of what a woman is supposed to look like in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally think so. Thank you for inserting yourself.
So our next question is a follow-up from Bella, who writes, you mentioned that you said you do have a theory on why the characters in Gutierrez's work have names at all. Could you share that idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've thought about it, and she uses different mannequins and different names. So like in the series Girlfriends, there's Anita and Marie, and then there's, I forget the names, but another set of names where she's a different mannequin. So I think it's partially, I think it is part of the comment on performativity that sort of parallel to how Sherman uses her title of Untitled Film Stills to set up the idea that she's embodying a character. Gutierrez uses the names that we know aren't her name to embody, to kind of signal that she's embodying a character of some sort. So I think that's like my theory. It's not that fleshed out, but that's what I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Our next question is from another anonymous attendee. The question is, in the newer series by Gutierrez, the artist's portrait is spread across multiple figures, while in the older series, Sherman, there is a singular figure that stands in for the self. Do you think this inscribes a trajectory for the future of feminist art?
Yes, wow, that's like such a good question. Yeah, great job, Anonymous. I think so. I think that it's a movement towards sort of pluralism and transnationalism and intersectionality. Like, yeah, that's kind of the point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I read them as well. Great. Well, we are at the end of our attendee questions.
Great questions. Thank you for asking them.
Amazing questions. And that's actually a great note to end on, thinking about the future of feminism and intersectionality. And I really loved the way that you finished your talk on that note as well. So I want to thank Sarah again so much. This was fantastic. And of course, to thank everyone who attended and everyone at Vassar who helped facilitate this program and at the Loeb Art Center. And I want to just invite everyone to continue following our upcoming exhibitions, programs, and events, both treading into in-person territory and continuing to do virtual programs. Please sign up for our e-newsletter, follow us on social media, and we look forward to seeing you again in person and virtually very soon. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for coming, everybody.